Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Cove. My name is Haley Young, and I'm an assistant director within the New Venture Group here at UCI Applied Innovation. It is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Ian Cesa. Dr. Ian Cesa founded Horizon Consumer Science in Los Angeles over 21 years ago and has been helping startups, corporations, and nonprofits get the right answers to research projects ever since. Ian has a PhD in psychology from USC and has previously taught market research and the importance of consumer insight in their MBA program. His extensive experience with running successful market research projects is reflected in the success of his company and the long-standing retainers and exclusive arrangements he has with leading brands. Ian now lives in Melbourne after having spent the last 30 years in both Los Angeles and Paris. Ian is here today to talk about how to run a successful market research project. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Haley. I arrived in Los Angeles in 1984, the week after the Olympics, and I remember reading a column from the preeminent sports writer for the LA Times at that time, and he said, the crowds in Los Angeles are ones that they're so edgy that they will leave after 90 meters of the 100-meter dash. And I was actually reading some commentary on the Dodgers Red Sox game 3, and the commentator was amazed that the crowd was still there after the 18th inning, but he said they all arrived late. And I think we have the same issue going on today. People arrive late. I hope nobody leaves too early. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is how to run an effective research project, was the title that they gave, but it applies to an analytics project as well. So how come it's not working? This one. Okay, so why do we do research? Any guesses?
Get answers.
To get answers, right. Okay, so any other answers? Any other ideas? Why do you do it? Yep. Pardon? For the best solution? Yep. All right, so go back to the getting answers for a minute. There are lots of ways to get answers to questions, aren't there? Doing it with research, if any of you have done it, it's actually a really difficult thing to do. You had your hand up?
Yeah, so in terms of solutions, to back that solution with the quantifiable data, maybe?
Yep, very good. You guys are already on the right track. This presentation is actually directed mostly towards people who are actually consuming research, not necessarily the ones who are generating it, the ones who are consuming it. So people who are in brand management positions or positions where you're making decisions that are really important for your businesses, and you need to be able to do this stuff. If it's for practitioners, I hope you get something funny out of this presentation, but it's directed mostly at those kinds of people. Okay, so what I'm talking about is really any kind of feedback from any constituencies that you serve. You know, in the case of a business, it might be your customers. In the case of a non-profit, it might be the donors who are donating, or it might be the people on the receiving end of a charity or something like that. But it's any situation where you're talking about getting feedback from your constituencies. At its simplest level, that's what I'm talking about. B2B, B2C, those kinds of things. Sometimes it's the only way you can get the answers to the questions you want, right? But there's a bigger issue involved here that I want to make sure we clear before we go into the details. It's really difficult and really expensive to do research well. So we want to make sure, the reason we do it is because what we really want is we want to be able to provide the best solution for the problems that we've got or the questions we're trying to answer. The reason we do research is because it's based in science. And science basically is objective, empirical, verifiable, logical, and unassailable. I mean, ultimately, that's what it's about. Any specific research project is not going to be like that. But that's the goal we're trying to achieve, and that's why we're so careful about the way we do it. So basically, what we're really trying to do is, as one person said, is we're trying to develop decisions. We're trying to make decisions based on evidence. And in searching for some quotes related to this, I came across one from Michael Crichton, who is a really interesting source for something like this. But what he basically says is that opinion in the absence of evidence is just prejudice. Now, it's interesting. I've done this presentation several times now over the last 4 years. And this slide takes on incredible new meaning ever since the 2016 presidential election. Just think about that for a minute. Okay, so basically what I'm talking about is a number of different things. I'm not just talking about data that you might collect. I'm talking about data that might come from various different sources. It might be passive transactional data or marketing dashboard data, extracted data from large data sets, you know, the big data that we all have. It also includes data that we actively collect, and it might be some combination of all of those things. So what I'm talking about today applies to those kinds of things, and ultimately what we're trying to do is use the techniques and tools of science to get to the right answer. In my career, over the last 25 or 30 years, what I've noticed is that almost all business questions can be grouped into one of these 5 categories. And they sort of flow from one to the other. If you're in the process of developing a marketing plan or developing a new business, you're typically going to be in the first category, which is the business of recognizing trends. So what are the trends that you're trying to understand and take advantage of? Once you get past that, you're in what I would call the strategy development phase. So that's about who are you going to target with your business idea, and what is it that you're going to say to them that's going to attract them to you. Now, a lot of people talk about, would phrase that as being your unique selling proposition. I don't believe in unique selling propositions because there are none. Everybody can do everything. What you need to do is make an argument that's convincing. Once you get past the developing strategy phase, you know who it is you're targeting, you know what it is you're talking about, you're then in the product or service development phase. Usually you've got something like that already in mind, but it ought to be refashioned or rethought depending on what your specific target and your specific benefits are. And then once you've done that, once you've got that all organized, you're then in the situation of how do you communicate effectively. And that's both in terms of what messages are you going to use and where are you going to put it. So you've got questions related to those kinds of things. And then once you've done all of that, you've implemented it all, you've launched your product, or you've launched your new marketing plan, you're then in the business of keeping score. How well did we do? Did the people we want, did they see what we were trying to communicate to them? Were they exposed to it? Did they pay attention to it? What did they do about it? Did they go to our website and buy our product? Did they go to the store and buy our product? What else did they do? Also important in that respect is what did our competitors do? Because this doesn't go on in a vacuum. People pay attention. They sometimes respond to the things that you're doing. But the questions that are really important, they almost all of them fall into one of these categories. And one of the most important things to do is to recognize where you are in that process. And when I talk to a client and they come to me with a specific issue, that's the first thing that I'm trying to do is figure out where are they in this process. And if they're further down, if we're in the product or service development phase or the communication phase or the keeping score phase, I want to know what they've done at the other phases that are further up the list. Because if they haven't done that properly, there's not much more point me doing something further down. If they have done it properly, then I know what it is my benchmarks are. If I don't, then I'm really just shooting in the dark. Okay, so let's talk specifically about the steps. First step is to focus on the questions you want to answer. So from the point of view of the people who are actually the consumers of the research, this is the single most important thing. And it's the one thing that I find clients don't do well enough. They don't spend enough time doing this. Come up with tentative answers based on what you know about what you think is happening. Clients are sometimes reluctant to tell me what they think the answers are because they fear that all that I'm going to give back to them is the answers that they thought. And that's a serious concern. And if you're seriously concerned about that with the people that you've got either inside your organization or outside the organization who are going to help you with the research project, then you probably should find somebody else. Because if you're worried about that, then they're not the right people to be working with. But the reason I say these two things are really, really important is because you know your business better than anybody else. And it's really important that you use that knowledge to help guide the research project that you're going to do. Nobody else can do it for you. It doesn't matter whether you have the technical skills to be able to run a research project or not. These are the things that you can do. Smart people can always do this. It's really important to do it. I'm going to come back to these things in a minute. You need to write a brief that majors in the questions and the possible answers. Even if you're doing it internally, you don't need to go outside in order for this to be important. Put stuff on paper. Sometimes you're going to surprise yourself with what you learn just by putting it on paper. I'm going to argue that you really need to get help from somebody experienced. That might be somebody inside your organization, but it might also be somebody outside. Another area where clients typically fall down is everybody comes to the presentation of the research findings, everybody's gung-ho, they go back to their desk, and things just fall apart. Nothing happens. My advice is always fast follow with an action plan. Build it into the process. Another area where that's really, really important, I'm going to come back to this one. I'm going to come back to all of these and talk about them in detail, but remember what's happened. I won't go into the details of that at the moment. Okay, so coming up with tentative answers to your questions. As I've already said, most smart people know their jobs. They've got hunches about what the answers are. Articulating what those are is really important because that actually helps guide what it is you're going to do in the research project. And don't just assume that whoever's helping you with the project can read your mind. They can't. They don't know what you know. And sometimes even just trying to articulate an answer tells them about the assumptions that you're working with in terms of running your business. Usually what happens with if you articulate your answers is that becomes the guiding principles along which you develop the research design, right? It's the difference. What I'm talking about here is the difference between science and voodoo. If I give you a cup of tea leaves and I ask you to stare at it, if you stare at it long enough, it'll tell you an answer. The question is whether or not that answer is even worthwhile knowing. And if you don't know what questions you're asking, if you don't know what it is you're trying to find out, you won't know whether the answer is meaningful. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. It's the difference between research and voodoo. Anybody here in the category management business or had been in the category management business? In the early days of that process, it really was like voodoo. You would have these big stacks of paper that were all about sales and trade-offs and all sorts of things that came from looking at what's flying off the grocery shelves. And you would sit there for 2 hours and you'd go through it page by page by page, and eventually it'd tell you something. But seldom was that the most important thing to know. So I've already said you can build your action steps around it. The answers act as a guide for what you're going to ask and who you're going to ask it of. Whether or not you're going to interrogate data that you've already got, or whether or not you need to go and collect data that you don't already have. And usually, it's not that those things it's not that those become the only things that you look at, because what I usually find is in the process of trying to get answers to specific questions, you learn the most important stuff. It's like, that's what we thought the answer was and it's not. So why on earth isn't it that? And then you go looking for in the data that you've got for the other elements that actually really do make a difference. Think your questions and answers through logically. This is really important. This is part of writing it down, because sometimes you'll find that you really don't need to do the research. You already know what the answer is, or you can come to a conclusion logically about what the alternatives are, and you can make a judgment among those alternatives without actually doing anything more. It saves you a lot of time and a lot of money. All I'm saying here really is for people on the consuming end of research, the ones who are actually going to commission research, use your brains. Don't assume that the person doing the research is actually going to do it for you. Use your brains. So I want to talk a little bit about case studies, just a couple of case studies, because what I want you to think about is, okay, so what are the really important questions in the business that I run or the businesses that I have run? What are the really important questions? And I don't mean questions like how many, is it 60% women who are buying my product versus 40% men? That's not a really big question. I'm talking about a really big question really big questions that actually drive the performance of your company. So this one is, this is a case study. So this came to us from one of our clients. So this is basically, our client came to us, they had developed a website for selling exclusive homes. And this is sort of the kind of home that we're talking about. The $10 to $20 million homes that are in places like Bel Air and Beverly Hills. In fact, it was in Los Angeles, so it was about selling homes that were in Bel Air and Beverly Hills. The client had worked for 2 years on developing this site. They had all sorts of high-end bells and whistles associated with it that they thought would be appropriate for the high-end clientele that they were going after. And after the 2-year development phase, they were just about to launch it. And this is basically a website that they sell to real estate agents. So the agents are actually the consumers here, not the people who are selling the homes. And they said, oh, we probably should just do a little disaster check on this just before we launch it. So all we did was schedule, it's a disaster check, so right, all you're trying to do is see whether or not there's anything absolutely major that could be a problem. So we did 2 focus groups in a focus group facility in Beverly Hills. Within 5 minutes of presenting this concept to the real estate agents, so these are agents from places like Coldwell Banker Previews, Hilton and Highland, Sotheby's, the people who are dealing with those kinds of homes. Within 5 minutes of presenting this concept to them, they said, look, it's not going to work. The reason is that the people who are selling these homes, they don't want their homes exposed to everybody on the internet. The currency, and then you get into a sociology of wealth in Los Angeles. And one of the things you learn is that wealth in Los Angeles is not really about how much money you have, it's how many layers you can afford to have between you and the general public who are going to see the website. So you've got the housekeeper, the business manager, the accountant, the professional manager. You've got all of these layers between you and the general public. And the last thing on earth you're going to do is bypass that and put your home with a lovely virtual tour, put your home on the internet so that anybody can go in there and see what kind of works of art you've got, what kind of sculptures and things, and potentially figure out whether or not it's worthwhile robbing. 2 years they worked on it. A fundamental assumption was that the people who were selling these homes would want them to be broadly available because that would actually increase the possibility that they're going to sell it for a higher price. It wasn't true at all. They could have checked that assumption about 2 years earlier and saved several $1 million in development, but they didn't. So my point here is, oftentimes what you can do is, an important thing to do is really to check your assumptions. So in terms of the questions you ought to be asking yourself about the businesses you run is, what are the assumptions? What are the really fundamental assumptions on which my business is based? And do I have those validated? Are they validated to a strong degree? Doing a little bit of work, it takes, it was like $8,000 in about 3 weeks. You can figure out whether or not those assumptions work. Usually, so you're going to save yourself a lot of money if your assumptions are completely off. Usually that doesn't happen. Usually what happens is that you learn something extra that helps you develop a deeper understanding of of the assumptions that you've made. So you sort of you change them a little bit. You change the working assumptions just a little bit. It makes your business better. So the likelihood of it being successful is better. Here's another case study. This is really about getting your positioning right. This is, do you really understand who it is you're trying to target and what it is you're trying to say to them? And this was about wireless routers. And I can tell you that the company that we did this for is not one represented here. So I can't tell you who it is, obviously. So the client came to us and said, we've redesigned our packaging for our routers. We think there's a real opportunity to simplify the way packaging is done for routers to make it much more consumer friendly. What we want you to do is to test our packaging against our new packaging ideas, against the existing ones, and also against our key competitive packaging. Okay, so we do that. I won't go into the details of the methodology of the way we did it, but nonetheless, when we got the results back, what we find is that the existing packaging performs way better than the new packaging, which is a real problem. And the existing packaging still doesn't do as well as the competitors' packaging. So again, they've spent a lot of time working on this. So then we start backtracking, because here we are now, we're at the point of communication. They've got the product, they're not changing the product. What they're talking about is the packaging, which is a communication element. So we say, okay, so what's the strategy that drove this? You know, how did you come up with the idea that, that simplifying the packaging was really what the most important thing was? And they didn't have an answer to it because they actually hadn't done it. They just sort of worked through without checking that assumption. So then we ended up going back and trying to understand why was it that people would evaluate the new packaging as being worse than the existing packaging. Does anybody want to have a guess as to why it might have been the case? Remember, it was a much more simplified packaging design versus a very complicated packaging design, similar to the ones you see here. Yep, pardon? Shows no value? Yeah, well, it's related to that.
Eye appeal?
Pardon?
Eye appeal?
Eye appeal? No, not eye appeal. They thought the packaging was cheaper or the product was cheaper?
The product was cheaper because the packaging looks cheap.
Yes.
And the product has got to be cheaper.
Yes.
And therefore not the same quality that you're looking for.
Got it. Yes, absolutely. What are the two most important things for a wireless router to do? Not what they do. What are the two most important qualities for a wireless router? It works. Reliability. Sorry? Portable. Not the two most. It's important, but not one of the two most. Range is about, who said that? Yeah. Yes, range is about power and performance. Reliability, performance. Okay? Yeah. All right, well, reliability and performance is all we need. There's a lot of others, I'm sure. Okay, so the existing packaging has got all of this stuff on the box that the people who are buying it don't understand. I mean, I'm sure that most of you, when you buy a router these days, most of the stuff on it you don't understand. I don't understand it, but I still buy it. Okay, so here is a packaging for a router that I do understand, but now it seems like that's a kid's toy. If I understand that it can't possibly be very powerful or very strong or very reliable. And that's the issue. That ended up being the answer to that problem. Is yes, simplified packaging is a good idea, and making it more consumer friendly is a good idea. But if in the process you make it seem more like a kid's toy than these really powerful, I mean, look at these here. I mean, they look like something from outer space, and that gives you the impression that they're going to be powerful and reliable, right? So that imagery is really important. You can't take that away. So anyway, another issue is if you're going down the path, make sure that the questions you're asking are actually strongly related to the audience that you're trying to influence. So you've all been thinking about your key questions for your businesses. I mean, the idea for these case studies was just to stimulate that thinking. So let's move on and talk about go back to the steps again. So what I've said first, focus on the questions you want to answer. Come up with tentative answers. Write a brief that majors in those questions. Get help. Fast follow with an action plan. And remember what you learn. And if you want to take a picture, go ahead. I'll just leave it there for a minute. Okay, so let's talk about writing a detailed brief. When you write your brief, it should contain a couple of things. Your questions, what you think the answers might be and why. The why part is really important because that tells whoever's helping you with this research what your thinking is related to the whole issue. And then why those answers are important and what decisions rest on the answers. Sometimes what we find is you go through these steps and you get to this third point and you say, okay, so here are the potential answers to this question, Would it actually change any decision that I'm going to make? And if the answer is no, then don't do the research, because it costs you a lot of money, it takes a lot of time. Even if you do it internally, those two things are still true, because you're using internal resources that you could be more effectively used in some other way. If it's not going to change a decision, don't do it. You should also have a timetable. I've already said the two resources that are really important for a research project, money and time. Time is usually an underestimated resource. If you've got a really critical question that you need to answer, and you've decided that the only way you can answer it is by doing some analysis or doing a research project, it's going to take time to do it. If it's really critical, then there are a lot of other decisions and a lot of other actions that the organization needs to take that are going to rest on it. The shorter the amount of time that you can spend getting those answers, the sooner the organization can move on. The longer you spend, the more the expectations about the impact of that project grow. If a project takes 5 weeks, it's actually relatively easy to implement without people trying to second guess what the answers might be, or try to move ahead with things without prejudicing what the outcomes might be. The longer you take, the more pressure there is, because everybody else in the organization is waiting. The expectations grow. Then you come with the answer, and they say, we had to wait for that? We had to wait that long for this? Come on, why did you make us wait that long? Time is a really important factor. Don't underestimate it. And from the point of view of the people helping you, there are always a million ways to skin a cat. In terms of the way you do analytics, the way you do research, there are lots of ways you can do things quickly. That can get you sort of a 75-80% answer if the timetable is critical. If you've got time and you want to be absolutely 100% certain, then you take more time and you spend more money. But there are lots of things that you can do that'll fit within a timetable. If the people helping you don't know what the timetable is, you're going to spend time trying to make something fit into a timetable. One of my best friends and former business partner, a guy by the name of Jim Bischoff, some of you might know him, he always used to say, there always seems to be time to fix it once you realize you've got a problem, so why not just do it right in the first place? So time is a really important thing. Budget, again, the same thing. If you've only got a small amount of money to spend on something, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. If it's a really important question, you really should do it. There are things that you can do with small amounts of money. If that's all you've got, they're going to get you answers. They're going to get you 80% there. It's important to know what that budget is, because otherwise you might end up with a research design. You might end up with the Cadillac and all you wanted was a Chevy. The one thing you should leave open, and I see this is a mistake that consumers of research make all the time, is leave open the methodological questions or analytical strategies. That's really the responsibility of the person that you're getting to help you with it, or the organization you're getting to help you with it. Unless you know specifically that there is an analytical tool or a specific method that you have to use. But leave those things open. Your job is to focus on the questions and the answers and the timetable and the budget. Get some help from people who can actually work within those and give you a good methodology. Okay, so get outside help and hold them accountable. You can't read that, can you? No, I did that on purpose. This is actually the basic level in my organization is an analyst. So these are all the skills that the analyst needs in order to be able to do their job effectively. You can't even see what the topic headings are, but the first half of it is around research methodology, the second half of it is around statistics. If you don't know that stuff, you're not going to do a research project well. And chances are, most of the people who are in the positions of running organizations, they don't have the time to learn this kind of stuff. There are other people who already know it, nerds like me. So get experienced help. What am I talking about there? How do you go about getting that help? So if you're going to go to outside consultants, get proposals from 3 companies that you think can do the work. Are you familiar with the way the research community in the US is structured? Probably not. So last time I counted, there was something like 6,000 market research firms in the US. That's probably a little bit less now because of consolidation. But the vast majority is still in the thousands. The vast majority of those companies are actually going to be what I would call data collection companies. So these are people who are focused just on providing facilities for focus groups or providing sample for internet studies. The kind of company that you want to help you with is somebody who is what I would call a problem-solving company. I mean, we're not in the business of collecting data, so we're in the business of solving problems, right? So don't focus on the data collection so much as whether or not the company can help you solve those problems. When you evaluate the proposals, good proposals are going to do the following. They're going to state clearly what the problems are to be solved or the questions to be answered. They may not be, if they're good, they won't actually be in the same way that you couched it to them. They'll actually be paraphrased and reworked, but they should be right. You should agree with them. Sometimes I don't see that. Sometimes I look at at proposals, because I've actually been on that side of the fence as well. I look at proposals, and what they major in is, when they talk about the objectives, what they major in is the data they're going to collect, not so much the questions that are actually going to be answered, and the rationale for why those questions are important, and the rationale for how you're going to go about doing it. But they should state clearly the problem. They should present a research method for doing it. The number of times that I see research proposals where the method that is proposed is not strongly tied to the specific problems that need to be answered just boggles my mind. I mean, it is the single most important thing, and then even if you get the research problems right, sometimes what you see is a methodology that is sort of a generic methodology. Or we're going to do a survey of 300 people, or we're going to take your customer data and what did I see recently? Oh, we're just going to do a little cluster analysis. It's like, okay, fine. What are you going to do the cluster analysis for? How is that going to help with the questions that you need to answer? The method should be tied to the problems. Make sure that it is. Sometimes, and this is actually probably more likely to be the case than the one that I just talked about. Sometimes the proposals will go directly from the research methods to the timing and the budget. There's no analytical plan. So basically the assumption is that once we've told you what data we're looking at, what we're going to do with it, then it's obvious the specific steps we're going to go through in the analysis, or what data we're going to collect. That's not actually true. It seldom is it the case that the explication of the research methods in terms of the sample and the questions that are going to be asked, seldom is it the case that follows through to one single analytical plan. And what I find when I write analytical plans is that they're really a good check to yourself about whether or not you got the earlier parts of the proposal right. Because sometimes when I go to write an analytical plan, I say, well, and this is, again, it's really a logic plan. So, we talk to these people. If we do this kind of analysis and the outcomes are such and so, then here is what the conclusion should be. And when I go through those steps, I sometimes look at it and I say, oh, hang on a minute, I forgot some data that are really important. I go back and I revise what it is I'm doing. I revise the methodology. I might change the sample, or I might change the data that I'm looking at. I might look for other data. But it's a really important step. If you're evaluating research proposals and you don't have an analytical plan, don't use that company. If they don't understand the connection between the data they collect and the questions that they're asking, and with that connection being the analytical plan, you shouldn't use them. Yep. Okay. So, we had a client that, actually I was working on the client side, and I was hiring outside resources to help with a brand development project. So that it was the client was already in business, and they wanted to develop a new brand. And so we got proposals from 3 or 4 different companies. Background, objectives, they were all good. Methods were fine. No analytical plan. Just, we might do some perceptual mapping. It's like, well, okay, so explain to me how perceptual mapping is going to answer the key question of how do you develop a new brand? What are the key elements of the new brand? They couldn't do it. When I asked them, they couldn't do it. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. The proposal should have detailed timing. It should have steps in the process. It should have responsibilities for those steps, and those responsibilities should involve you. You don't want an organization that's going to go off, or even if it's somebody within your organization, you don't want them not to be interacting with you. And a budget estimate that includes what's included and what's not included in the cost estimate. I always love well, not always, but there are some budget estimates that are really funny, and you've probably already seen them yourselves, where they'll say, this project is going to cost $25,000, but here are all of these other add-ons, and then when you tally that all up, it comes to $150. It's like, no, you don't want that, because it's not being very transparent. What you want, people who are buying consumer research, they've got budget constraints like everybody else. They want to know how much is actually going to cost me all up in the end. So that's really important. There should be assumptions or contingencies on which the budget's based. Usually there are some. There are always some contingencies that you can't plan for. The question is really what are those, and what kind of implications might they have if they're not true on your budget? It's really important to have those kinds of things. Yep. 10%. Yeah. Sometimes you'll have a 10% contingency just for, if there's anything that's anything we didn't consider, it's 10%. If there are some really, really specific things that impact the cost, like how difficult it is to get hold of the people that you're trying to get hold of, or how difficult it is to make sense of the data that you've been given, sometimes those things will have a separate contingency, but usually it's about you'll usually have a blanket contingency of about 10%. The other thing is you want to know is who's going to work on the project. You can actually go and hire a very well-renowned firm and feel like you're safe because you've hired a well-renowned firm. And when in actual fact, when you actually get to talk to the people that you're actually going to work with, you realize that you don't have a lot of confidence in them. I've done a lot of stuff in conjunction with my clients, in conjunction with the big consulting firms, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, in lots of different parts of the world. And it never ceases to amaze me how little the actual people working on a project know about what it is I'm doing, even though they're the ones who are responsible for it. So you need to know who's going to work on the project, and you need to hire on the basis of them, not on the basis of the company reputation. I'll give you an example of one of the pitfalls there. So one of our clients was using, for a different part of the organization, they were using Gallup to do a consumer engagement study. Are you familiar with the Gallup consumer engagement concept? And so they've been doing that for several years, and the consumer engagement for one particular division of the company started falling off a cliff. And the company had already mobilized a task force internally to deal with that consumer engagement problem. And they asked us to be part of that. And when we got involved, we said, okay, so why don't you just send us the results of the study that got you to that point, that got you to this conclusion. And when we looked at it, we went back to them, we said, no, you don't have a consumer engagement problem. What's happened is that your customer mix has changed. So the people that so it's not as if all of your Chinese customers are now unhappy with you. It's that you've got a lot more Japanese customers coming in, and they're just generally less happy with you than the Chinese. So don't focus on trying to make the customers who are coming in happier. Actually, just deal with what you've got as it is and focus on this other customer base. So it was a situation where if the people who were involved in that project, if they had better skills, they would have seen that. In actual fact, when we read through the whole analysis, what we realized was that the people from the Gallup office, what they were trying to do was sell another piece of research, and so they needed some evidence for that. It didn't actually make sense. And I would say, if you're going to do it yourself, which I'm sure that some of you do, and some of you will, get some advice. At least get some advice on design and methods, and then also setting up the data analysis. A lot of times I see, everybody is really gung-ho about a research project, going out and talking to consumers, collecting data from consumers. And people can write a survey, and anybody can put a survey on SurveyMonkey these days. The question is, what do you do with the data when you get it back? How do you actually do the analysis? If you're doing it pencil and paper, if we were trying to survey you as you walked out of here, we might give you a survey, pencil and paper survey. At the end of it, we'd collect 200 surveys, and then somebody has to do something with them. That's usually where most people who are not familiar with research fall down, is they don't know what to do with it. They sort of know that it needs to end up in some kind of analytical software package, even if it's just Excel, but they don't know how to get there. It's really important to know what it is you're going to do with the data before you go and collect it, because otherwise you'll end up with some really difficult problems. I had another issue on that. So one of my clients was a ketchup manufacturer, and I was working with this I just started working at this company, and some other people had already done this research project where they wanted to see how their product compared to Heinz. And so they did some semantic differential evaluation. So basically what a semantic differential is you got two attributes that are polar opposites to each other, and you got a line between them. So it would be sweet, sour, something like that. And you ask people to put a mark on the line as to whether, how sweet it is, how sour it is. So they did it they tasted the client's product, then they tasted the Heinz product, and they put a mark on the line for where they thought both of those products were. There were no numbers on the line, so they got all of that data back, and then the analysis guy scratched his head and says, "Well, if there are no numbers, I can't analyze it. What do I do?" Anybody got any ideas about what you would do? Yeah, exactly. It's that simple. It's not hard. But nonetheless, there is a very simple example of how you can go wrong if you're not thinking about how you do. I mean, it's really, semantic differentials are a neat way to do stuff. But if you haven't thought about how you're going to do the analysis, you end up with dumb things like that. Okay, developing an action plan. As I've already said, if your research or analytics project is not going to lead to specific action, it's not going to change any decisions you make, don't do it. But if it is, then it's really important to develop this first. Usually, if you've done the project well, the results will be clear about what you do, and the design ought to lead you to that very clearly. If it doesn't, if you still end up feeling like you're looking at the tea leaves, or you need to go and kill a chicken and spread its guts out on the floor, then you're probably in the wrong place. But sometimes there is actually really a long distance between the research findings and the action steps. And you need to use the research in order to build the action, because it's not obvious. And if you don't do it soon, if you don't do it very early on when the research findings or the outcomes of the analysis are really fresh in the minds of everybody involved, you probably won't do it very well. In a way, it's a little bit like, if you've got a DIY project at home, you're building a table or something, right? So you spend this weekend on the table and you only get a third of it done, and then you're busy for the next 4 weekends because you've got all sorts of stuff going on, and you come back to it later, 5 weeks later, What do you spend the first hour doing? Trying to figure out where you were, right? And usually it's like, my God, where did I put those screws? You know, it's like, it's that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff happens with research too. If you don't work on it quickly, chances are you're going to forget really important details. So move quickly with this. Explicitly articulate what the action steps are. Don't just assume that because the research results point you in a direction that you know what to do. We had a client where we ended up, it was a positioning study, and our positioning was around size. It was for a fast food restaurant. Our positioning was around the size of what you bought. And the reason we were doing that was because we were hearing all sorts of complaints about McDonald's hamburgers, right? And we were talking to people who are doing manual labor in fairly rural areas of the country. And they were saying, well, you know, I go in there at 10 o'clock, go into McDonald's at 10 o'clock in the morning, I got to eat 5 of those things before I'm satisfied. And so we just sort of, that led us to the positioning around size. So we go to the product, we go to the product development people and say, well, look, you've got some really big products that are on this menu already. You've got some things that have got a really substantial taste. You know, they're not tasteless like some things are. Build your product selection around that. It's like, and the product development manager says, well, that's really hard. I don't know how to do that. And we thought it was obvious, but she didn't. And she'd been working on it for 5 years. So sometimes, you know, you need to be very concrete in the way you can't just assume that the people you're giving the information to know what it is they need to do with it. You need to lead them through it. So get those action steps articulated. Do it quickly while the knowledge is fresh. I've already said this, knowledge decays quickly. The impetus for implementation wanes too. Everybody moves on to the next thing, or they go back to fighting fires. And they forget why it is they're doing this in the first place. And sometimes that's actually one of the consequences of taking too long to get a research project done, is people forget. They've got, you know, it's like this problem is layers deep in the problems that I have to deal with today. And I need to, you know, to bring it back to the surface takes a lot of effort. And then sometimes implementation just takes a long time. It's not that simple. And then if you've hired an outside firm, use them to help you get to the action steps. Usually they can help you understand in more detail what the research findings mean in terms of the actions that you would take. So, you know, sometimes they'll actually draw conclusions from the research, or they'll extrapolate from the research in ways that are not appropriate. Send it back to the people who helped you with it. They can usually help you do that. And that's basically what I've just said. Okay, remembering. We have a client now that we've had for 27 years, and the very first project, within 3 years of our first project with that company, not one person that we had started working with was still there. And we had done several projects for that organization. And that was the first example, the first experience that I ever had that made me realize that most organizations have no institutional memory because people leave. People just don't stay. But it's really important, because one of the things about doing research or analytics is that it really ought to, and this is sort of the, this is what science is not just about one-off kinds of things. Science is about building knowledge, right? And you can think about your own business as an opportunity to build knowledge about how that business runs in the environment that it operates in. And if you don't have that knowledge base, if you don't allow that to build, then you're always doing the same thing over and over again. But if you do, it has enormously beneficial consequences for you. Remember what you've learned. And the way to do it, another benefit is that sometimes the research that you do or the analytics you do, it's to answer specific questions, but it's related to other questions that might come up later on. And if the people in the organization don't know what was done, then they can't figure out whether or not it's useful for those other purposes. We have a project right now. So Our client it's a department store operator in various parts of the world, and they want to bring in, and they serve an international customer base, so it's almost all travelers, and they want to bring in food service into those outlets. So they say, well, we want to survey the customers in all of the different outlets about, what it is they eat and drink before, what it is they eat and drink afterwards, how much they're willing to spend, that kind of stuff. And so they asked us to help them with it, and I said, look, we already know a lot about what they want, because we've done this other project over here, which was an entirely different project. It was about developing a new part of the store, and one of the elements of that store was whether or not you put food service in, and if it was food service, what kinds of elements you put into that. So we already had a lot of detailed knowledge. It wasn't necessary to actually go and do the research project that they wanted to do, because we already had the information. But nobody on that team knew it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I've already said good business thinking builds on the knowledge that already exists. Some people say to me that, in my business, you get two criticisms of research. One is, remember the Ford Edsel. Like, okay, fine. Do you know specifically what happened with the Ford Edsel? Probably not. The other one is, research can't tell you what the future is going to be. All it can tell you is what was the past and what is today. But I'm really interested in the future. And I would argue that that is entirely wrong. If you do a good job of building knowledge about your business through the systematic interrogation of the constituencies that you're trying to influence, and you use that knowledge as a way of essentially developing a theory about how your business works, it will point you in the direction of the future. Science operates not by telling you what happened. Science operates by telling you what might be the truth so that you can extrapolate to something new. And that's really what happens when you do it well. So, as in other areas, your knowledge about your business builds with your experience, and the research should be a really important part of that. And if you forget about it, and the people who did it leave and nobody knows what it is, there's no institutional memory for it, then that's a huge loss to the organization. I've already said that. And then make sure that what you learn is widely known. Disseminate it as far as you possibly can. Because, the example I just gave you about food service, we had all of this information over here in marketing, but the team that was charged with developing the food service offering wasn't connected to marketing. They didn't know about it. And then institutionalize what you've learned in important documents, like annual reviews, situation analyses, future business plans. Put it in there. Even if it's an appendix, put it in there. One of the things that we used to do for one client was every year we would write the situation analysis for their forthcoming year business plans. And one thing, and they were running promotions in various markets all over the world. Not all of those promotions had any evaluations associated with them, like any formal evaluations of whether or not customers were aware of them and whether or not they acted on them, that kind of stuff. Even in the absence of that, I would go back to the agencies that ran those programs and I would say, okay, we didn't do any evaluation of it, but what's your opinion? Do you think it worked or not? And if you think it worked, okay, so how would you do it better if you wanted to do it again? That's all I wanted in the analysis, because if I don't have that, all I've got is, well, we ran this program in this market and we ran that program in that market and we ran this other program in this other market. And somebody coming along 5 years from now can go look back at that and say, okay, we ran all these programs, we're thinking about running another one that's similar, but we have no idea whether or not it worked. It would be nice, even if it was the opinion of the organization that ran it for us, it would be nice if we had their opinion about whether or not it was going to work again. That's all I'm talking about. Institutionalize the learning as much as you can. Okay, so just to sum up, just about finished. So doing research or analytics, it can be one of the best tools you have for solving difficult problems. It can save you money. Sometimes it can make you money, obviously some of the examples that I've already given you, and it certainly help you think better. What I would suggest that people who are on the consuming end of research should do is focus on the things that you do well, and hire people for things you don't do well. You can think better about your business than anybody that you're going to hire from the outside. Don't assume that you're going to hire God, because you're not. And you probably have a good idea what the answers are going to be, and if the answers come back and they're different from that, you ought to question it. But that's the starting point. Put a lot of effort into translating the findings into action. It's worth it. You spend a lot of money on it. You took a lot of time. You should do that. And do it quickly. And then make sure that your organization doesn't forget, even if you're not there. And I'm out. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So we have a little bit of time for questions. If you have a question, if you wouldn't mind coming up to one of the microphones, yep. Or if you can yell loudly, that's good too. Small businesses, so the question is, how do you choose a research method if you're a small business? How do you know whether you're going to use focus groups or a survey or whatever? Okay, so two answers to the question. First of all, if you're a small business, so whether you're a small business or a large business, that's one of the questions you should leave open to the people that you get to help you. If you don't know the answer to that, if you don't feel confident in your answer to that question yourself, get some advice. Find one of your friends who's already in another company. Ask them. They'll be able to help you. Or if you're going to hire somebody from outside, that's one of the things you should let them tell you. Let them give you the rationale. If you don't understand the rationale, don't choose it, because it still goes back to whether or not it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense to you, it's probably not the right thing to do. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you can learn a lot with very little. If you're like the example of the high-end homes, you know, the website for high-end homes, that was 2 focus groups, and the whole project was wrapped up in 3 weeks, and it was $8,000 total, and that was hiring out the whole thing. So you can learn a lot just by doing that. My advice to new businesses is always do something formal with potential customers, right? And by formal, I don't mean just chatting to somebody at a bar or at a seminar and saying, you know, here's my idea, what do you think of it? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is actually sitting them down, having a formal structured discussion guide associated with that, and a presentation of what it is your business is, and getting their honest feedback from you. And it's better not to do it with your friends. It's better to do it with people who don't know you, because they're less likely to tell you that your idea is great. So, yep.
Hi, thank you so much for giving us kind of a really high-level view of the selection process and criteria to keep in mind when considering various methodologies and analysis techniques and things like that. Mm-hmm. My question comes as an MBA student currently here at UCI. Yeah. There's always a gap between academia and practicality. First I have to ask, are there any economists in the room? Okay, otherwise I'd have to cage my response. They're like groundhogs. You know, you ask them a question and they can tell you where the next gopher hole or whatever it is, but they can't really give you the lay of the land. So in terms of continuing education, and trying to get brushed up on more skills. I mean, no offense to these amazing strategic frameworks by Porter, Kotler, and all these other folks, but it's been decades, and a lot of what we see coming out now seems to be more hype-related, like lean startup and the business model canvas, and many of those have not really made it through the trials by equal opportunity abusers, you know, for becoming something like on the level of Porter's 5 Forces analysis. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, you as a professional, where do you, at this point, continue your education? Where do you get brushed up on the latest, you know, techniques, the methodologies, and strategic frameworks?
Yeah. There's a couple of books that I would recommend first. There's a very little book written by 2 advertising executives from the UK. It's called How to Make Advertising Better and How to Make Better Advertising. So I think it's How to Make Better Advertising and Advertising Better. So find that book. It's actually pretty good in terms of understanding the sort of fundamental frameworks of how does marketing work and what kinds of expectations you should have it. There's another one, another book called How Brands Grow, and Byron Sharp is the author. Read that one too. Byron Sharp is the author, and the title is How Brands Grow. And what I like about these books is that they're really pretty simple in terms of, and they're pretty pragmatic in terms of the way they suggest things work. It's like the book about how brands grow is really great because, you know, what are you trying to do? I mean, you start a business, you're trying to grow it, right? If you're trying to be successful, you've got a brand, you're trying to build that brand. So, you know, how brands grow, it doesn't, it actually takes issue with Porter and Kotler, so it's a good one to read. Some of it is how do you learn? Statistical techniques haven't changed that much. Research methodology hasn't changed that much. You know, you've got for the things that we do, there are a lot of newfangled techniques. There's a lot of neuroimaging and all sorts of brain-related stuff. But the fact of the matter is, most of that's not really relevant to most businesses, and certainly to small businesses. It's not going to answer the most important questions. You know, the most important questions are answered by the data you've already got, or a little data that you need to collect somewhere else. Yeah, don't believe what you learn from your MBA program.
It's all hypothesis to me. I'm here to just test it and see what works the best.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks. Yep.
Yes, I have a question. What advice do you have if you're a new business and you want to do your customer research, but you don't have the relationship with that target group? For example, I can give you a specific example. I do product management consulting.
Yeah.
One of my clients is interested in people that treat diabetic ulcers, so doctors of podiatric medicine. So what are the best practices for engaging those people? And do you think if someone is paid for participating in research that it biases their answers?
Yeah, good, very good question. And you know, it was one of the areas where I could have gone into more detail with this, but I've turned a two-hour presentation into a 1 hour. So, but at a very practical level, there are all sorts of recruiting companies that can help you find those people. You tell them who it is you want, and they'll get them for you. Mm-hmm. And they'll set up those meetings with them in their offices. A lot of the market research companies, if you go to some of the directories for market research companies, they'll be able to help you with that. So that's the practical question. The question about whether or not paying them influences them, the answer to that is generally no. I don't believe it does. I think in the experiences that I've had, you know, we pay people small amounts, large amounts. Actually, I'll give you an example. We did a project several years ago for a mortgage company, and we needed to interview mortgage brokers, and they were really busy people. They're really hard to get hold of. And what we would do is, so we would actually give them gift certificates. So we had Amazon.com gift certificates for $50 or Wine.com certificates for $50. And you know, the reason we did that was because they're really easy to deliver. You get an email address, you deliver it. You don't have to, you know, lick envelopes and stamps and things. And at the end of a project, what we would do is go in and check to see who actually redeemed their gift certificate. It was unbelievable how small that percentage was. It was like one year we had this one project going, and we spent $60,000 on the gift certificates. When we went in to check, only 20,000 of them had been redeemed. So the people who, it's a gesture in the beginning, but people don't necessarily use it. So I don't think the money makes that much difference. I think it makes a difference to whether or not they'll give you the time, but I don't think it makes that much difference.
So follow-up question, is there a product then that you could actually send somebody a gift certificate, but he only pay if they redeem it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, what we used to do is claim them back. So one year we had $40,000 to distribute to employees for Christmas presents.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question?
Time for one more?
Yep.
So I advise and consult with startup companies. And if you'll notice behind you, there's a very nice example of branding.
Yep.
Okay, so one of the questions I often get from startup companies that appear to have a successful product is, how do I create what do I need to do to create a brand that is going to stand out, that is memorable, and that has a relationship to some extent about what the company is about? And sometimes we'll put together 2 or 3 or 4 examples. Have you done a project, or can you make a suggestion about how you would test how memorable a brand might be, especially when the company's brand new?
Yes. There's a couple of ways to do it. One of the things that we do is if you've actually got a design, one of the things we do actually these days is we'll recruit people online and we'll actually expose that mark for very, very short exposure periods, like 200 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds. It's like, and it'll be in conjunction with others, and then we'll assess either immediately or at some point later on in a survey whether or not they can remember it. So that's one way to do it if you want something that's memorable. If memorability is the only thing, if that's what the only thing is. We just did a project where we actually developed a brand mark for a region, a geographical region, and there's some pretty simple things you can do. I mean, you basically can ask people questions about what does it make you think of, how memorable is it. You can ask the questions that you have, and you can score all of the alternatives on the answers to those questions, and you can figure out from that which one you should go with. So you generally refer it to the customers that you're trying to influence and see whether or not they agree with you, or that they evaluate it on the criteria that you're trying to assess, that you're trying to achieve, and see whether or not it measures up. You can't do that sometimes. If memorability is the only thing, you can't necessarily ask people how memorable something is. You really have to get them to think about it, and that's why we do you have to prove the memorability. People can't tell you if it's memorable. So that's why we use the short exposure duration thing. Something that's really memorable is going to have an impact. It needs to do it quickly. It's milliseconds that you're going to pay attention to a mark. It's not seconds. You're not going to gaze at it. So it needs to make an impression very quickly. And if it doesn't, you probably need to keep looking.
I think the thing that adds complexity here, it's not a complicated project, but it is complex. And because it involves color, it can involve color, it can include font size, font style. And that's the part that gets a little bit, how should I say, challenging. But thanks a lot.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks. Thank you very much, I appreciate it.